Hello, everyone. I am Professor Peter Seipel, and in this presentation, I'm going to be talking to you about research and philosophy. In particular, I'm going to be talking about the area of philosophy that I specialize in, and that's ethics. My goal is to give you a sense for how people working in ethics use reason and evidence to help us get at the truth about the big moral questions that we face today. And more specifically, I'll be focusing on a topic that I myself have been researching in one way or another for the past several years. That is effective altruism. Effective altruism is a social movement as well as a philosophical theory. It's based on a very simple idea. We should do the most good we can. It's not enough to refrain from cheating, stealing, lying, killing, and so on. We have to go further. As average people living in a wealthy country like the United States, we live in material comfort. We are extremely well off. Now, you may not feel rich, of course, but in many ways, if you think about it, you live much better than some of the most famous kings and queens in history. Take Henry VIII, for example. Unlike Henry, you have antibiotics, you have painkillers, smartphones, Netflix, next day Amazon deliveries, cars, air conditioning, automatic drip coffee makers. The list goes on and on. Effective altruists are just people who think that fortunate individuals like you and me have to go beyond the usual moral rules. Effective altruists say that we should use scientific evidence and careful reasoning to figure out how best to improve the world, and then we should, in fact, try to improve the world as best we can using the resources we have at our disposal. Now, effective altruism in this sense is often called EA for short, and that's what I'll be calling it here. EA began very recently at the University of Oxford in 2009. Since then, it's experienced some considerable success. Peter Singer, who's pictured here, is a well-known philosopher at Princeton. In 2013, he gave a TED Talk on EA. Since then, the talk has gotten over 2 million views, and it's been translated into more than 30 different languages. A number of EA organizations have also been founded in the past decade. One of them was founded by Peter Singer himself, and it's called The Life You Can Save. The Life You Can Save is a charity evaluator. It's a charity that evaluates the effectiveness of other charities. In 2009, only 4 or 5 years after the founding of the organization, people already donated $12 million to the top charities recommended by The Life You Can Save. 80,000 Hours is another EA organization. It recently reported that over 3,000 people have changed their career plans to try to do more to improve the world. Another EA organization is Giving What We Can. Giving What We Can administers a pledge to donate. Since it began, 5,000 people have pledged to donate at least 10% of their lifetime income to the most cost-effective charities. A final nonprofit that I'll mention is called One for the World. It has EA ties, and it's dedicated to educating students about effective altruism. It encourages students to donate at least 1% of their postgraduate income to the most cost-effective charities, and it has chapters at universities across the country, including Harvard, Yale, NYU, Vanderbilt, and a number of other schools. Singer's recent book on EA, which we saw pictured in an earlier slide, also describes a number of people who have been convinced by moral arguments to embrace an EA lifestyle. One took a job on Wall Street to be able to give more to charity. Another gave away all his possessions. One donated a kidney. So a lot of people have been influenced by EA and have decided to join the EA movement. There's a lot more I could say here, but hopefully what I have said gives you at least some sense of how successful EA has been just in the past few years. It's a burgeoning social movement. It's growing. It's becoming increasingly popular, especially among young people. But as I said, EA is not just a social movement. It's also a philosophical theory. Supporters of EA tend to accept 2 key claims, and these 2 key claims are indicated by the name effective altruism. One is a claim about altruism. The other is a claim about effectiveness. The first claim is the altruism principle, and it says that we have a moral obligation to use most of our resources to improve the world, particularly by reducing suffering and saving lives. The effectiveness thesis adds to this that we shouldn't contribute to just any cause or any charitable effort. Instead, we should donate our resources to where we can do the most good, impartially speaking. So EA amounts to these two key claims: the altruism principle, as I'm calling it, and the effectiveness thesis. Now, taken together, these claims support a very striking conclusion. They imply that we should radically rethink the nature of our obligations to others. Normally, of course, we assume that giving to charity is a nice thing to do. It's generous, it's charitable, but it's certainly not morally required. If EA is correct, though, that's actually a mistake. EA, as it's understood by philosophers like Singer, who's again pictured here, it implies that when we spend money on luxury items like concerts and fashionable clothes and expensive vacations and meals at fancy restaurants and expensive lattes and so on, we're doing something seriously morally wrong. We should use most of our wealth and income to do the most good we can, to improve the world as best we can. And that means that we should refrain from indulging in these luxury items, and we should instead donate our money to highly cost-effective charities. Now, this isn't just a statement of opinion or preference. Effective altruists support EA by conducting research, by using reason and evidence to get at the truth about our obligations to one another. So what I'd like to do is talk to you about how they do that. And we'll start with the effectiveness thesis first. Remember that this thesis tells us to do the most good, impartially speaking. The thesis is based on a very simple idea. We should consider everyone's interests equally. We shouldn't prioritize our own interests, and we shouldn't prioritize the interests of people we happen to be connected to, such as members of our race, or sex, or religion, or whatever. After all, precisely what makes the racist is that they prioritize the interests of their race. And similarly, the sexist is a sexist because they prioritize the interests of their sex. One way to understand why the racist and the sexist are wrong is that they violate what's sometimes called the ideal of impartiality. In other words, they don't treat everyone's interests equally, even though they should. What the ideal of impartiality suggests is that when we act to benefit other people, we should do so without regard to whether the people we help are members of this or that particular race, or this or that particular sex, or this or that particular group, or whatever. Effective altruists just add to this the idea that we shouldn't prioritize someone's interests because they happen to be nearby. We should consider the interests of everyone as equally morally important, no matter their race, their sex, their religion, or where they happen to live. After all, arguably, where someone lives doesn't seem morally relevant. It does not seem to justify prioritizing the interests of some people over others any more than race or sex justifies this kind of prioritizing of interests. If we can save a life, it doesn't seem to matter whether the person we can save is 5 feet from us, or 50 feet, or 500 or 5,000, or 10 miles, or 100 miles, and so on. In this sense, effective altruists are cosmopolitan in their outlook. They think that distance does not matter morally. Whether someone is nearby or far away doesn't matter for our moral obligations. And in addition to this, as most people would probably agree, effective altruists think that the numbers matter when we're talking about helping others. All else being equal, it's better to save more lives than fewer. It's better to save 5 than 1, for example. So there's some reason to think that people would accept these ideas on reflection, these ideas about distance and numbers. But these ideas appear to be sufficient to give us the effectiveness thesis, which just says that we should do the most good impartially understood. In other words, all else being equal, we should benefit a distant many over a nearby few. Numbers matter, distance does not. Numbers matter because intuitively we think that we should save more lives rather than fewer, all else being equal. And we also think that distance doesn't matter morally insofar as we accept this ideal of impartiality, which helps to explain why racism and sexism are morally wrong. So that's the effectiveness thesis. What about the altruism principle? This principle seems more controversial. It's saying, after all, that we have an obligation to sacrifice most of our resources. And most people don't think that's the case. Most people think there's nothing wrong with luxury spending, even in a world like ours where millions of people die of preventable causes. So does that mean EA is false? No, not necessarily. In fact, supporters of EA have argued that our own values commit us to the altruism principle, this idea that we have an obligation to donate most of our resources to those in need. So to support this idea, effective altruists appeal to the following hypothetical case, which I'll call Bob's Bugatti. So in this case, a runaway train is coming down the track. And Bob is right there by the track. Bob sees the train coming, and he also notices that a child is playing on the tracks. If Bob does nothing, the train is going to continue down the track, and it's going to kill the child. Bob cannot stop the train. There's no way for him to do that. But he is by a switch, and if he throws the switch, he'll be able to divert the train onto a side track. So if he throws the switch, he'll be able to save the child because the train will go onto this side track. However, the train will destroy his $3 million Bugatti, which is parked just at the end of the side track. And Bob has in fact invested nearly all his retirement savings in the Bugatti, and he hasn't been able to insure it because insurers often will not provide insurance for extremely expensive luxury cars like this one. If the car is destroyed, Bob will have difficulty making ends meet for the remaining 15 or 20 years of his life. So he'll lose all his retirement savings. So what should Bob do? Well, almost everybody agrees that it would be wrong for Bob to walk away without throwing the switch. Most people would agree that we shouldn't choose a car over a child's life, even if the car is rare and valuable, like Bob's. But the thought is, according to effective altruists, with respect to the millions of children suffering and dying in developing countries, we're in essentially the same position as Bob. After all, if we donate to charity, we can save a child's life. Our donation will mean one less child will die of preventable causes. Now, of course, it's true, the child we can save is further away than the child Bob can save in the Bob's Bugatti case, but as we've just seen, distance doesn't seem to matter morally. And note too, that by donating most of our retirement savings, we can save a lot more children than Bob. It's going to cost Bob $3 million to save a single life. But recent estimates suggest that we can save a life for $5,000 or maybe even less. Now, philosophers use cases like Bob's Bugatti, which we call thought experiments, to try to elicit your intuitive reaction. And these reactions are designed to help us uncover your own values, to help us figure out what exactly your values are on reflection. In our case, the common sense reaction to Bob's Bugatti, the idea that Bob should throw the switch, destroy the Bugatti, and save the child's life, seems to support the altruism principle. Remember that idea that we should donate most of our resources to prevent suffering and save lives. But we saw earlier that our own values also seem to commit us to the effectiveness thesis. So if what I've just said is correct, there's some reason to think that the very ethical commitments that we ourselves hold commit us to something like EA. Our own values seem to imply that we should give most of our resources to the most cost-effective charities. Now you might wonder, well, if that's actually the case, why don't we realize it? Well, for many supporters of EA, the reason is that there are distorting psychological factors that get in the way. We recognize that we have an obligation to help in Bob's Bugatti because the needs of the child are conspicuous, they're salient. The child is right in front of us, about to be flattened by a train right in front of our eyes. And in contrast, the needs of children dying of malaria and measles in developing countries is not conspicuous because these children are distant, because we don't witness their suffering. They're much easier to ignore. But conspicuousness, of course, as such, doesn't seem morally relevant. What matters is just whether we can save lives at small cost to ourselves And as effective altruists have suggested, by donating to charity, it looks like we can do precisely that. So I've been talking about the core commitments of EA, the effectiveness thesis and the altruism principle. I'd like to end this presentation by highlighting what I think is a tension between these two commitments. And this gets into some research that I myself am currently working on. So what I want to do is consider another thought experiment. I'll call it Bob's Toyota. In Bob's Toyota, everything is just like Bob's Bugatti. The child is playing on the tracks. The train is coming down the tracks. It's going to kill the child unless Bob throws the switch and diverts the train onto the side track. The only difference in Bob's Toyota is that rather than a Bugatti parked at the end of the side track, there's Bob's Toyota. Bob has invested most of his retirement savings in this Toyota, and it's worth about $10,000. What should Bob do in this case? Intuitively, we would probably all agree that Bob should throw the switch and save the child's life by sacrificing the Toyota. After all, if Bob should sacrifice a $3 million Bugatti, then surely he should sacrifice a used Toyota as well. The altruism principle, that claim that says that you should sacrifice most of your resources to save lives and prevent suffering, seems compatible with, and in fact, it even seems supported by this intuition. What about the effectiveness thesis, though? Remember, this thesis tells us to do the most good impartially speaking. In Bob's Toyota, we can save a life for about $10,000. That's the value of the Toyota. By donating to charity, though, as I said earlier, we can save a life for roughly $5,000. If that's right, then it means that we can do twice as much good per dollar by letting the train run over the child on the tracks and then selling the Toyota to a used car lot and giving the proceeds to a highly cost-effective charity. Now, to me, that looks deeply morally wrong. Intuitively, it seems to me that Bob should throw the switch in Bob's Toyota, even if he can do far more good through donations. But the trouble here is that the effectiveness thesis, as we've been talking about it, seems to suggest that we shouldn't throw the switch, not in Bob's Bugatti or even in Bob's Toyota, where the cost of saving the child on the tracks is much lower. Why? Well, because the effectiveness thesis implies, as we saw, that distance is morally irrelevant and numbers matter. Because distance is morally irrelevant, we shouldn't prioritize the needs of the child on the tracks, the child right in front of us, over the equally morally important needs of distant children. And because numbers matter, we should try to save more people than fewer. But to do that, what we should do is let the child on the tracks die, sell the car, and donate the proceeds to charity. Again, though, this result looks deeply counterintuitive. Because it's counterintuitive, it gives us reason to wonder whether the evidence really supports EA in the way that effective altruists have maintained. So what we've seen in this presentation then is an example of how philosophers use reason and evidence to figure out our moral obligations. As we've seen, philosophers appeal to our own beliefs about ethics to research and inquire into the nature of right and wrong, just and unjust, good and bad, and the like. They appeal to these beliefs to try to answer the big questions that we face today, both as a society and in our own lives.